So we've talked a good bit about World War II and just what's happening in Europe. Before moving into the Pacific side of the war, as we fought Japan, um, and before we wrap up things in Europe, one of the main things that we really have going on during this time period is one of the most tragic, horrifying things that really has happened in the history, really, of modern world. Uh, During this time period, during World War II, what happened was known as the Holocaust. And so when we take a look at this, Holocaust is a word that means widespread destruction. It has really originates, it doesn't have to do with just what's happening here in World War II, but the idea here, a lot of times destruction through like burning. And so we'll talk more about that. But during this time period, the Nazis, led by Adolf Hitler, murdered about 6 million Jews during World War II. Okay? And in addition, there were about 4 million other groups of peoples that were discriminated against. But really here, 6 million of these people were Jewish. And so when Hitler came to power in Germany in 1933, the Nazi Party was Hitler's party, had a hatred for Jewish people. Okay, and so it's difficult to pick out really what the trigger was. Really, before this time period, this was not something new. Unfortunately, Jewish people were persecuted for hundreds of thousands of years throughout history. And so a lot of Jewish people did not have even a homeland.
And so Hitler blamed the Jewish people for losing World War I. Germany lost, and so he thought that Jewish people were weak, were inferior. Really, this discrimination wasn't based on anything other than hatred, and really, it was a great opportunity for Hitler to focus hatred and focus on one particular group to where he could say, we are going to make changes. We're going to eliminate these people that caused us to lose the war. There was no, basis for this. There's no proof. There's no, it was completely ridiculous, but enough people were desperate. We talked about starving, had no jobs, were homeless, just in need of help. One of the things Hitler outlined was how they were going to eliminate Jewish people from the country, and not just, unfortunately, get them to leave, but in many cases kill them. And so there were several phases that Hitler instituted. So the Nazis passed new laws in 1933 to limit the rights of Jews in Germany. Jewish people were no longer allowed in public places like movie theaters, sports stadiums. They had to essentially stay at home and stay at work wherever they were working. And this is where things started to show up, where there were signs saying Jews unwelcome. They were hung in stores all throughout the city. Jewish-owned stores were boycotted by non-Jewish Germans. And so there were a lot of Jewish people that were successful and that owned businesses. During this time period, people were encouraged to not go to their stores, to not go to their businesses. And ultimately, there was a lot of looting and a lot of damaging of these businesses out of the sheer hatred that they had for Jewish people. Phase 2 in 1939, so this is several years later. You could see 1933 is when they started things. In 1939, the Nazis forced all the Jewish people into one area of town. This was called a ghetto. In the ghetto, it was fenced in, barbed wire. People were not really let in and out without getting past guards. There were armed soldiers, and so there was little food, water, medicine, very crowded and dirty. You can see these pictures where these people were treated terribly. And in a way, this was the start of where many people started to die because of the harsh treatment, even in these ghettos. But then we move on to phase 3 in 1941. Jewish people were put on trains to concentration camps. And so these concentration camps, really there were work camps and concentration camps. The work camps, people were sent into these camps, and they were forced to do very hard manual labor. And so at this point, originally, people did not know where they were going on these trains, and the train rides were just terrible. Just hundreds and hundreds of people packed into cars with not even a bathroom there, if you can imagine these long multi-day trips. And so some people died just on the trip, but it was terrible conditions. And then when they got to the concentration camps, you can see these people, this is where they slept. These bunks were just side by side and several rows up, all the way up to where, like, no pillows, really nothing. They had where these slave laborers were forced to work, and many of them worked until they died because they were barely fed at all. So we are going to study and talk a little bit more about what was happening in these concentration camps, and how many times the people that were there, the Jewish people, were shot, were just thrown into piles like of dead bodies, and many of them just buried or burned even. People would go into these showered areas, and instead of water, gas was released and people were killed. And so these concentration camps, as you know, thousands and thousands of people were killed daily. To get up to that 6 million people killed, that number is just astounding. And so it wasn't until 1945, you could see the timeline, in 1945 Allied forces found the concentration camps. They were invading Europe, and really the majority of the world had no clue that this was going on. And as they found this, they were just distraught to know that this had been going on for years and years, and the Germans were keeping this secret. Here you see a quote. An American officer described the condition of the prisoners at one camp. They were dirty, starved skeletons with tattered clothes. It's unbelievable how any human can treat others as they were treated. And so really they were basically skeletons. Like there was nothing left of them because they were starved but still forced to work. And so really this idea of how could people do this? And it's easy for us to look at right now and say, how did this even happen? How did people do this? How did people let this happen? And it was something that it got to the point where at first, the soldiers maybe just were following orders. But it got to the point where even if they did not want to do these things, some of the German soldiers, they would be killed if they didn't follow orders. And so it's based around hatred. And there's hatred and discrimination that happens, even today. And so it got to the point where it just kept getting further and further with the mistreatment of these people. And so moving to one of the most famous Jewish people during this time was Anne Frank, primarily because we have very detailed records of her life. Anne Frank was a Jewish girl living in the Netherlands in World War II. In 1942, these German soldiers took over different parts of different countries, and in the Netherlands, they started to take Jewish people and send them to concentration camps. And so many families, when they got word that this was happening, did what they could to hide from the Germans coming. And so what did Anne Frank and her family do? Well, as many of you know, they prepared a place to hide. Okay, they had a secret hiding place in Anne's father's office, to where they had built this up, where they could go behind this bookshelf, the bookcase, and there was like a little attic area. Anne was 13 at the time when her family moved into this place. In her diary, she kept a very detailed diary of what it was like. She lived in this small space with 7 other people. And so this is a picture of her spot, like it's jam-packed, packed and crowded. The conditions are not great, but they set it up to where this is where they lived. And so they had family help them out and sneak them in food and materials to live. But it was a very scary time. And it was in 1944 that the German police found where Anne Frank and her family was hiding. They arrested them and sent them to a concentration camp. Unfortunately, she died in this concentration camp just 2 months before the end of the war, where people were discovered and the Allied troops started to free those that were in the concentration camps. So she did not make it out of the camps alive. But her diary was found eventually in that hiding space, and it became basically the most famous account of what it was like to live as a Jewish person under Nazi rule and live in fear and what was happening during that time period. So there's a brain pop that details a lot of this that we're going to watch tomorrow. But in the meantime, there's so many resources and materials out, and a lot of Anne Frank's materials, they've kind of done abridged versions or shorter versions that are kid appropriate or friendly to where it's not so long. But I'd encourage you to explore a little bit more about her life. There's many other during this time period that they've written about Jewish people that have made it through this time period alive. There is in downtown Atlanta a Holocaust museum that you can go and hear firsthand accounts. Up until recently, they had people that were actually alive during this time. There are very few people, mathematically, they would have had to have been very young at the time, but they, at the Holocaust Museum, even have family members later on, even grandkids that tell about artifacts that have been passed along or stories. And so it's important to study this time period so that we don't let anything like this ever happen again. Just the sheer hatred and death that happened during this time period, it's hard to even think about and to study, but it is, like I said, important to know that things like this happen in history so that we never let anything like this happen again.